They said the mirror never showed your reflection, only your death. Fire licking up your back, a noose tightening, a river rising past your lips. Whatever you saw, it came for you. And the more people looked, the more the town believed it, until belief itself became the sharpest curse of all. But what if the mirror wasn't magic? What if it was something far colder, something man-made, buried in science, memory, and fear? In 1884, in a quiet town in New Hampshire, the Delancy family found out, too late. The mirror arrived on a Tuesday, the rain scratching softly at the windows of the Delancy house like fingernails trying to get in. It came in a tall pine crate, wrapped in burlap and stained like it had been pulled from a basement that wanted it buried. Margaret watched from the stairs as her father and two farmhands pried it open. It smelled of rot and oil. Inside was something too large, too dark, taller than any man, its frame carved from blackwood and polished to a lacquer that refused to reflect light. There was a faint smudge near the base, like soot. Tobias, only 12, touched the glass with one curious finger. "It's cold," he whispered, like he expected it to speak back. Her mother didn't want it in the house, said it wasn't in the will, just an unclaimed asset from a cousin's fire-gutted estate up in Brattleboro. But her father, always half in love with the macabre, insisted it stay. "A piece of family history," he said, propping it up in the main hallway between the staircase and the parlor, where it would catch no light and no warmth. That night, Margaret passed it on her way to bed. For a second, she thought she saw movement not in the glass, but behind it. Not a face, not even a shape, just a shift, like fog pulling back from the edge of a cliff. She told herself it was her own breath, the rain, a trick of shadow. But as she lay in bed, she heard her brother scream. Not a loud scream, not long, just a short, sharp cry, and then nothing. By the time they reached his room, he was sitting up in bed, pale, sweat clinging to his curls. "I saw myself," he said, his voice like glass. "I saw myself choking, and I couldn't stop it." Her mother wept. Her father frowned. But no one laughed. The next day, Tobias was dead, a chicken bone lodged so deep in his throat they had to break his jaw to remove it. Margaret never looked in the mirror after dark again. Not then, not yet. But she began to listen to the way it hummed in the hallway, how it never gathered dust, how it never, not once, showed her anything that looked like her. They buried Tobias on a Friday, under a maple tree that wept sap too early for the season. The preacher said words Margaret didn't hear, and the ground closed around her brother as if it had been waiting. The town whispered, of course. Whispers always came after a death that felt too sharp, too precise. A boy choking on a bone, after claiming he saw it happen in a mirror. No one said it outright, but she heard them at the general store, behind gloved hands at the church steps, in the long pause when someone knocked on the Delancy door and asked how the family was doing. Her mother didn't speak much after the funeral. She took to sewing by candlelight, letting her fingers bleed without blinking. Her father went the other way, busying himself with livestock records, porch repairs, anything that required a hammer or a ledger, as if noise could bury grief. But the mirror stayed exactly where it was, watching. That was the word Margaret kept returning to, watching. It didn't show her reflection, not clearly. When she passed by, her shape flickered in the glass, murky and warped, like looking at herself through water that had gone stagnant. No matter the time of day, the surface remained dim, and no lamp or candle could coax out a proper shine. She tried once, dragging a lantern close and staring into the center. What looked back wasn't her, it was her outline. Yes, her hair, the white of her nightgown, but her face was a smudge, as if something in the glass had wiped it away. That same week, her cousin Clara came to stay. Clara was 17, with a sharp laugh and eyes that had already seen things Margaret didn't understand. She called the mirror a parlor trick and dared Margaret to look in it every night before bed. "We see what we want to see," Clara said, lighting a match on her boot heel. "Your brother had too much imagination, that's all." But the next night, Clara ran from the hallway, her skin pale and eyes bloodshot. She wouldn't say what she saw, only that it involved snow and wolves and something that wore her face but had no eyes. She left the next morning without saying goodbye. That was when Margaret began recording it all in a small red notebook. Who looked in when they looked, and what they claimed to see. It started as a game. It didn't feel like a game anymore. By the end of that week, the mirror had been polished 4 times and still refused to reflect daylight. Her father ordered it covered with a cloth, but every morning the cloth was on the floor, folded neatly. Margaret never saw it fall. She just began to notice that the hallway was always colder than the rest of the house, and that the mirror, no matter how still the world was, had a way of feeling like breath. The third person to look was Mr. Whitlow, the apothecary's son, who came by on errands and stayed longer than he should have. He was 20, quick with compliments, and always smelled of mint and crushed sage. Margaret caught him staring at the mirror one afternoon, long after the deliveries had been handed over. She asked him what he saw, and he shrugged. "A lake," he said, "frozen over, and something red on the ice." He laughed it off, but his hands were shaking as he tucked them in his coat. The next evening, he fell through the river near Ashby Mill, chasing his dog across the thinning ice. His body surfaced with blood frozen to his scalp. That was when people stopped laughing. The townsfolk began talking about the Delancy mirror as if it had teeth. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed the house. One woman claimed she saw something in her tea after walking too close to the Delancy windows. The preacher preached louder. Her father refused to move the mirror, though his voice had taken on a tightness, the kind that hinted at something slipping beneath the surface. "Coincidence," he muttered. "Coincidence and hysteria." But Margaret saw how he avoided the hallway now, how he entered from the back door and didn't glance at the covered frame as he passed. Only her mother seemed unmoved, though her eyes were glassy and far too still. Margaret thought of Tobias, of Clara, of the red thread she used to mark the margins of her notebook each time someone else had looked. It was up to 4 now. One of the farmhands had stared into it while cleaning mud from his boots. He saw fire. The next day, the barn caught flame. No one was hurt, but the chickens never laid again. Margaret began to notice that those who looked didn't just die, they changed, became quieter, lost pieces of themselves. Clara had been confident, even cruel at times. After the mirror, she barely spoke. Mr. Whitlow had been full of wit and flirtation. Afterward, he could barely meet her eyes, as though he'd already started grieving himself. The mirror didn't kill you, Margaret thought. It convinced you, it fed you the image, and you made it true. The idea clung to her like damp linen. That night, she sat at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the cloth-covered mirror, trying not to breathe too loudly. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere upstairs, her mother's sewing needle clinked against a thimble. Margaret listened to the creaks of the house, to the near silence of a home learning how to fear itself, and in that silence, she heard it again, the whisper of fabric being pulled down. When she turned, the mirror was uncovered. No one else was in the hallway, but the air smelled faintly of mint and something colder, sharper, something like ice. Margaret's Aunt Eliza arrived in a carriage that looked too clean for the road it had taken. She wore black, not for mourning, but as if it were armor, the veil pulled low over her eyes, gloves buttoned to the wrist. She hadn't been invited. Eliza never waited for permission. She swept into the house as if she'd lived there all her life, took one look at the mirror, and said, "That thing should have been burned." No one argued. Her presence carried the weight of someone who had already survived something no one dared name. At dinner, she spoke in low tones, asking questions Margaret noticed her parents refused to answer. When did the first death happen? What did he see? Has anyone dreamed of it yet? No one mentioned the cloth being found folded again that morning, or the faint outlines of handprints on the glass. Eliza waited until the candles were low and the house had gone still, then stood before the mirror with her veil lifted. Margaret watched from the stairs, breath caught in her throat. Eliza stared into the dark pane, unmoving for nearly a minute. Then she struck it. Her gloved hand, closed into a fist, drove straight into the center of the glass, with a sound like a frozen lake cracking beneath weight. The mirror held for a moment. Then it broke. A fracture snaked from the bottom right corner, branching like a vein. Eliza dropped her hand, bleeding now, and said only, "He lied to me. He always lied." She didn't explain. She went to bed with her palm wrapped in linen. By morning, she was gone, her room empty, her boots left behind. The trail outside showed nothing but wind patterns in the snow. 3 days later, a hunting party found her impaled on the fence post outside the Delancy cemetery. The wood had splintered straight through her back. Her spine looked exactly like the cracked line in the mirror. The post had no blood on it. It had snowed the night before. Margaret's father ordered the mirror covered again, but not removed. "We keep it as proof," he said, "so no one forgets." But Margaret did not forget that the fracture in the glass now resembled something else entirely. Not just a line, but a branch. A split, something growing. She pressed her fingers to the outline and felt a vibration beneath the surface, like breath against a drumskin. It was not just showing deaths. It was recording them, etching them in, making room. That night, Margaret opened her notebook and drew the crack exactly as she remembered it. And beside it, she wrote the date, the name Eliza, and a word she had never written before. Copy. Because whatever was in the mirror, it was learning. One death at a time. The mirror moved on a Sunday. No one spoke of it at first, not even Margaret, who woke early and found it no longer in the hallway, but standing silently at the end of the dining room, where the morning sun touched nothing, and the shadows gathered too thick for reason. The cloth was folded once again, perfectly, resting atop the piano like a napkin laid for a guest no one wanted. Her father blamed the draft. Her mother said nothing, only stared too long at the empty space in the hall, as if the air still remembered the shape it had held. Margaret touched the floor beneath the mirror's new resting place and found no drag marks, no scuffs, no indentations in the rug. It had not been carried. It had not been slid. It had simply arrived. That night, she placed a teacup on the floor in front of it, a child's trap, silly in its simplicity. If the cup was shattered by morning, she'd have proof. When she woke, the cup was whole, but it had been moved 3 inches to the left. The next morning, the mirror was in the parlor. A day later, it was on the upstairs landing, directly outside Margaret's bedroom. Each time it relocated, it chose a spot closer to her door. She told her father, who muttered that she was dreaming, and told her to stop letting fear write fairy tales in her mind. But Margaret knew what she saw, and worse, what she felt. Each night, as she tried to sleep, the air near the door thickened, the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath without knowing why, the kind that listens. By the fourth morning, Margaret did not open her door. She stayed seated on her bed with a book she could not read, waiting for the creak of the floorboards that always came just before sunrise. It came, as always, slow and soft, then nothing. When she finally opened the door, the mirror was gone. This time, she found it back in the hallway where it had first arrived. But something had changed. The fracture from Eliza's strike had widened. Just slightly, like the crack had been fed. That night, she dared herself to whisper a question into the glass. "What do you want?" The mirror did not answer, but the air behind her shifted, just enough to stir the pages of her notebook. She turned around. Nothing there. She turned back. Her reflection was gone. The mirror showed the hallway, the staircase, the rug, the candlestick. But no, Margaret. It was the first time the mirror had taken something from her. Not her breath, not her sleep, but her place in the world. It had stopped reflecting her because it had begun watching from her side. He arrived on the train from Concord with a satchel full of paper and questions. Elias Finch, mid-30s, narrow-eyed, the kind of man who read more than he spoke and rarely blinked when he did. He said he was a historian, though Margaret thought he moved like someone who had touched things he shouldn't. He had written her father weeks earlier, offering to investigate the mirror, claiming he had an interest in artifacts of psychological influence. No one knew what that meant, but her father allowed it, desperate now for someone, anyone, to name the thing that had turned their home into a waiting room for the dead. Elias introduced himself with a handshake that felt more like a test and walked the house slowly, touching nothing, staring too long. When he reached the mirror, he stopped breathing for just a moment. Then he smiled, not kindly, but like a man who had confirmed a terrible suspicion. He took notes with a fountain pen that scratched like bone on wood, murmuring to himself, pausing every few sentences to peer closer. He didn't look into the mirror, not fully, just circled it, watched how light refused to settle on its surface, how reflections stuttered or vanished depending on the hour. "It's not glass," he said finally. "It's obsidian, volcanic, hand-polished, rare, difficult to shape without distortion." Her father asked if it was cursed. Elias gave a tight smile. "I don't deal in curses, but I do deal in design. And this wasn't made for vanity, it was made for extraction." The words sat wrong in the air, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull. That night, Elias asked to sleep in the study. Margaret caught him hours later with a candle pressed near the mirror's edge, sketching something onto a piece of vellum. A diagram of concentric circles and heat lines. She asked what it meant. "Mirrors bend light," he said, "but obsidian holds memory. It's not reflecting you, it's reading you." She didn't understand, not fully, but something in her chest tightened. "Reading what?" Elias stared into the middle of the glass, careful not to meet his own eyes. "Fear, the primitive kind, the kind you don't speak aloud. Whatever you bring to it, it shapes." "Then how does it know how we'll die?" she asked. "It doesn't," he replied, folding his diagram. "You do, somewhere deep. It just shows you the ending you've already written." That night, Margaret watched the mirror through a slit in the curtains, waiting to see if it breathed, if it moved. It didn't. But when she opened her notebook the next morning, a second drawing had been added beneath her own, the crack now branching wider, with new lines curling outward like veins. It was dated, not by her hand, not in her ink. The handwriting didn't match hers, but it looked familiar, like someone inside the glass had started keeping notes too. Margaret looked into the mirror just once. She did it on a Wednesday, when the house was quiet and the sky had gone the color of dishwater, the kind of dull gray that made time feel slower. Elias was away in town, her father asleep in the chair with a cloth over his face, and her mother hadn't left the sewing room in 2 days. Margaret stood in the hallway alone, barefoot, the mirror uncovered and waiting. She didn't blink, didn't speak, just looked, and what she saw wasn't a death, not like the others. No drowning, no blood, no fire. What she saw was worse. A soft, humming haze filled the glass, gray and thick, like fog moving underwater. Shapes hovered just beneath it, unformed and shifting, like someone was erasing them as fast as they drew them. There was no reflection, no version of herself, just static, alive and silent, and in the center, the faintest trace of her own outline, but it flickered in and out, thin and almost hollow, like the mirror didn't know how to draw her, or like it had tried and given up. She waited for something to happen, for some vision to click into place, but nothing came. No death, no image. Only that pulsing gray, like breath behind frost. She backed away slowly and closed the door. She told no one, not even Elias. She didn't sleep that night. She thought about Tobias, about Mr. Whitlow, about Aunt Eliza, and her blood on the snow. They had seen endings, but Margaret hadn't. She hadn't seen anything certain, only confusion, only noise. Was that better or worse? Elias returned the next morning, frowning as he noticed the mirror had been moved again. It now stood in the study, facing the bookshelf. "Odd choice," he murmured. "Whoever's doing this wants to confuse the thing, or hide from it." Margaret said nothing. She couldn't stop thinking about the fog, about how it felt like something trying to speak in a language she wasn't built to hear. That afternoon, she took the mirror's cloth and buried it in the snow behind the house. She didn't want it folded anymore, didn't want it watching from a neat little pile. She wanted it gone. But that night, it was back on the piano, dry, clean, folded the same way. Margaret's hands shook as she opened her notebook to write it down. But something was already there. 3 words she hadn't written, written in the same hand that had copied her crack drawing. Static is mercy. She stared at the words until her eyes burned. Because if the mirror had mercy, then it also had intention. And if it had intention, then it wasn't finished. It was choosing, and it had not yet chosen her death. Elias brought the ledger into the house like it was something dead. The spine was rotted, the ink faded in places, but the name on the inside cover was clear enough to silence the room. Dr. Alric Vale, physician and scholar of mental impressions, born 1792. The ledger had been found buried in the old records vault beneath the Concord Town Hall, misfiled under equipment inventory. It was no inventory. It was a log of mirror tests. Elias read aloud at the dinner table, though no one touched their food. The entries were cold, methodical. Subject 1. Woman, age 32, prone to spiritual hysteria, viewed obsidian sheet. Result. Subject saw her own drowning. Later attempted to drown daughter during sleep. Subject sedated. Subject 2. Boy, age 11, saw static. No change. Marked as resistant. Subject 3. Mirror relocated. New results inconsistent. Multiple subjects began to report identical deaths burning behind doors that would not open. Mirrors moved again. Then the handwriting changed, grew erratic. Diagrams filled the margins, branching lines like veins, shapes that resembled tree roots or nerves. A single phrase repeated. Memory will echo if asked correctly. Elias looked up. He wasn't recording reflections. He was harvesting reactions. Fear, pattern, repetition. The mirror wasn't designed to show truth. It was meant to study how we accept lies. Her father stood up, pale. You're saying this isn't magic? Elias nodded slowly. It's older than magic. It's design. Trauma stitched into glass. And something about this one, he tapped the edge of the mirror gently, like testing a coffin, stayed awake. That night, Margaret returned to the notebook. The words were still there. Static is mercy. She flipped the page and found more writing, faint and crooked. You are not subject 3. The handwriting was more desperate now, as though written from the wrong angle. She closed the book and locked it in the drawer. Something was using her pages, something that could write from the inside. Ilias began sleeping near the mirror, determined to map its behavior. He kept the lantern burning low, muttering in half-sleep, drawing symbols in chalk around the base. He told Margaret that mirrors, especially those made from volcanic glass, had long been used in rituals to conjure memory, not spirits. We've always feared what we can't forget, he said. That's what this thing feeds on, not death, memory of death, the story before it. The crack in the glass widened that week, by a hair, but it changed the whole reflection. Margaret stood before it once again and saw her outline, but this time she was not alone. There were shapes behind her, not faces, not people, just presence, watching through the fog, as if she had become the mirror, and something else was looking out through her. The first outsider came on a cold morning, breath fogging like ghosts between fence rails. Mrs. Tallow, the baker's wife, arrived unannounced and stood on the porch like she'd forgotten why she came. Her hands trembled as she asked to see the mirror. Margaret's father refused, but when he stepped away to fetch Elias, Mrs. Tallow stepped inside anyway. She moved like someone pulled forward by a thread only she could feel. Margaret didn't stop her. She only watched as the woman stood before the uncovered mirror in the parlor, clutching her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned blue. Mrs. Tallow didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "The fire's in the cradle," and left without another word. That evening, her house caught fire. They found her by the nursery door, her arms burned raw from trying to save a child already gone. Words spread like spilled ink. By the end of the week, 3 more townsfolk had arrived, 2 teenagers and a widower, each demanding to look, swearing they wouldn't be afraid, as if fear could be swallowed or silenced. Elias tried to bar the door, but her father hesitated. "They're going to come whether we allow it or not," he said. "Might as well see what happens." And so the mirror became a ritual, a test, a dare. They came at dusk, one by one, and left pale and hushed. Some muttered what they saw. Others said nothing. 2 were dead within days. 1 hanged himself in his barn. The other was struck by lightning in a field with no clouds. The others began to change slowly, losing weight, forgetting words, walking with shoulders hunched as though something waited behind them. Margaret watched from the stairs each time, her notebook now filled with names and times, and notes that made less sense the more she read them. Symbols appeared between the lines, drawn in pencil she didn't own. And always, the same phrase kept returning in scrawled ink she never remembered writing. It shows what you feed it. Elias grew more frantic. It's not a curse, he snapped at her father one night. It's a mirror with a mouth, and every look is a spoonful. He no longer slept. He burned incense and laid copper wires beneath the frame, speaking Latin phrases through clenched teeth. But the mirror only waited. It never cracked again. It never moved. It didn't need to anymore. People came to it. Margaret stood in the hallway one night, listening to the creaks of the floorboards and the wind curling through the chimney. She wondered how many people needed to believe in a thing before it became real, how many deaths, until it wasn't the mirror deciding, but the town itself, feeding its fear, one glance at a time. The widow came at dusk, as if the light itself had summoned her. Mrs. Corwin, pale as a candle left too long in the cold, wrapped in black lace that dragged behind her like smoke. She had not spoken since her husband's death found in his barn, with a pitchfork through his chest and his boots facing the wrong direction. No one knew if he had jumped or been pushed, but everyone knew he had looked into the mirror 3 days prior. Margaret heard her mother whisper that grief had loosened something in Mrs. Corwin's mind. But what arrived on their porch was not madness. It was resolve. The widow did not ask permission. She walked in barefoot, her dress hem soaked, and stood before the mirror without hesitation. She did not tremble. She did not blink. She only stared, the way someone stares at a locked door they've always known would open. Margaret tried to stop her. It doesn't show truth, she said. It shows what you already fear. Mrs. Corwin looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, with eyes that had seen something few people live through and fewer return from. Then, let it show me the truth I've buried, she said. The house held its breath. The mirror reflected nothing for a full minute. Then, Margaret saw it. Rope, a wooden beam. The widow, standing beneath it, mouth open in silence, her body already swaying from the ceiling of her own parlor. Mrs. Corwin made no sound. She only touched the glass with her fingertips, whispered something Margaret couldn't hear, and walked out into the dark. She was found 2 mornings later, hanging exactly as the mirror had shown, same beam, same room, same silence. Her neighbors said they heard nothing. Not a chair tip, not a rope creak, nothing. Elias did not speak for hours after they retrieved her body. He sat in the parlor, staring into his hands as if he could read answers there. Margaret sat beside him, her fingers still cold from cutting the rope. You said it only shows what we believe, she whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. I said it feeds what we believe. But if belief becomes strong enough, he trailed off, eyes drifting toward the mirror. It stops being suggestion. It becomes instruction. That night, the mirror reflected something new. A house. Margaret's house. But not as it was. No lights. No furniture. Only ash and scorched wood and soot-stained walls. And in the center of the ruin, a single object remained untouched. The mirror, upright in the rubble, still watching. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only backed away, closed the parlor door, and drew a single sentence in her notebook beneath the widow's name. It doesn't show the future. It plants it. Margaret stopped sleeping the night the widow died. Something in the air had changed, not just in the house, but in her own body, like her bones were listening for something. The mirror no longer felt like a strange object. It felt like a third parent, a quiet mouth in the next room, humming when no one was watching. It began to hum louder when she was alone. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure, a pull, as if it were drawing breath from her shadow. Elias became harder to find. He stopped eating at the table, stopped knocking before entering rooms. He muttered numbers now. Dates. Measurements. He scratched symbols into the walls of the study and carried his satchel everywhere, even to the outhouse. When Margaret asked him what he was doing, he said only, "We're past theory now." That afternoon, Margaret stood before the mirror again, not to look, not to ask, but to confront. She pressed her palm to the cold surface and said, "I know what you are." The mirror did not ripple, but it responded. A faint shimmer moved beneath the surface, like heat on stone. Then an image bloomed. Elias, slumped over a desk, blood pooling beneath his chest. Her stomach turned. But before she could look away, the image flickered once, then twice, and was gone. Static again. Like before, a mercy. She told Elias what she saw. He did not blink. He only sat down and pulled out an old photograph, sepia, curling at the corners. It showed a man beside an obsidian mirror, almost identical to theirs. The man's name was scrawled on the back. Dr. Alric Vale. He wasn't just a psychologist, Elias said. He believed the mind could be bent like heat metal. That fear could shape memory. That if you controlled memory, you controlled behavior. The mirror was a tool. For what? Margaret asked. To break people, he said, and to see who could not be broken. Elias explained that Dr. Vale had designed a dozen such mirrors, each one slightly different. But only this one had survived fire, war, and abandonment. Because it evolved, he whispered. It learned. Margaret stared at the mirror's surface, which now looked darker than ever. Why did I see static? She asked. Why not a death? Elias studied her face for a long time. Then he said, because it hasn't written yours yet. That night, she locked her notebook in the drawer again, but when she checked it at dawn, a new entry had been added, her own name, her own date of birth, and beneath it, 3 words in the slanted ink she didn't recognize. Pending, still listening. She turned the page and found one more phrase, scrawled so faintly it looked like dust. Say it out loud, and it becomes true. She closed the book and didn't open it again for days. The mirror had stopped showing death. It had started waiting for confirmation. The boy came on a dare. He was maybe 9, the youngest son of the Lambrights, who owned the tannery near the southern creek. His name was Jacob, though Margaret only learned that after. He arrived breathless, cheeks red from the cold, with 2 older boys waiting outside the gate, shouting things like, "Go on, coward." And, "It only kills liars." Margaret caught him in the entryway, muddy boots already on the rug, eyes wide like a cornered animal. She asked what he wanted. "I just want to see it," he said. "They said it's not real, that it only works on people who believe in ghosts." His voice shook, but his hands didn't. She should have turned him away. She should have told him to go home, to stay afraid, to forget the hallway and the stories that circled it like buzzards. But instead she stepped aside. The mirror stood uncovered at the base of the stairs, tall and still and humming softly, as it always did when someone new arrived. Jacob walked up to it, stared in, and waited. Margaret watched from the parlor, barely breathing. A minute passed, then 2. No sound, no whisper, no change in his face. Finally, Jacob turned and said, "It's broken. I didn't see anything." He smiled bright and crooked and ran back outside. Margaret stood frozen, the cold now deep in her spine. She waited for the usual signs, the pale skin, the tremble, the sudden fear that clung to everyone after they saw their own end. But Jacob was unchanged. She looked into the mirror after he left. Nothing, just static, the grey fog again. Margaret ran to find Elias, who listened carefully as she described what happened. He didn't seem surprised. "Not everyone fears death," he said. "Some children don't understand it yet. Some minds haven't been shaped by it. That's why the earliest subjects in Vale's records were children. He wanted to see when the mirror began to work." "So Jacob passed the test?" Margaret asked. Elias shook his head. He didn't take the test. He didn't know what to fear, so the mirror had nothing to work with. "But what if it chooses for him later? Then it won't show him death," Elias said. "It'll show him someone else's. And that's worse." That night, Margaret dreamed of a little boy standing in front of the mirror again, Older now, taller, face hollowed out. In the reflection, there was blood on his hands, not his own, and behind him, something in the mirror clapped. When she woke, her ears rang faintly, like a bell had been struck somewhere deep in the earth. She wrote only one thing in the notebook that morning: "The mirror doesn't need your death, it only needs your audience." The preacher came with a hammer in one hand and a Bible in the other. Reverend Cotter had been silent for weeks, ever since his nephew hung himself after whispering she was already in the mirror at Sunday service. The town had begun to fray at the edges, windows boarded, doors bolted, curtains drawn, even in daylight. Still, no one stopped the preacher when he strode down the Delancy path, boots echoing like gunshots. Margaret met him at the door, but he didn't look at her. His eyes were fever-bright and wet at the corners, like a man already weeping for something he hadn't buried yet. "Where is it?" he asked, not unkindly. She didn't answer. Her father tried, but the preacher pushed past them both and found it on his own. The mirror had returned to the hallway, upright and waiting. The preacher raised the Bible first, speaking verses through clenched teeth, voice rising with every word. The room began to tremble, not physically, but in the air, in the weight of the moment. Margaret felt her breath catch. The mirror did not crack. It did not smoke or shiver. It only stood there, perfectly still, as if listening. Then the hammer came down. The preacher struck it dead center, and the sound it made was not of breaking. It was of impact without consequence. A low, resonant thump, like hitting something alive and too deep to bruise. The second strike echoed louder. On the third, a fissure finally appeared, a jagged, thin crack, veining from top to bottom. Margaret gasped. So did Elias. The preacher dropped the hammer and fell to his knees. "I saw it," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I saw fire, but not around me, in me." My mouth opened, and the smoke came out. He clutched his stomach like something inside him had turned to ash. Margaret moved toward him, but Elias held her back. "Look at his eyes," he said. The whites had gone yellow, not sickly, not natural, but like parchment that had been too close to flame. The preacher coughed, and something dark trickled from his lips. He died before sunset, collapsed in the chapel with his sermon still folded in his pocket. Elias called it echo trauma death, triggered by belief so strong the body followed the mind. He saw his own end too clearly, Elias said. The mirror didn't show him fire, it made him feel like he'd swallowed it. That night, the crack in the glass remained, but something was different. The surface shimmered faintly, not gray like before, but amber, warm, flickering. And when Margaret looked closely, she saw the preacher's outline still imprinted there, mouth open, hands raised, not screaming, but reaching, as if he was still inside, trapped in the moment of belief. She touched the glass. It was warm. The mirror hadn't been broken. It had been fed. It was Elias who noticed the symbols first, barely visible, etched into the bottom left corner of the mirror's frame, revealed only when the lamplight caught at just the right angle. They weren't letters, not runes, not anything Margaret recognized from any of the books stacked in his satchel. They were circular, spiral-like, almost botanical, living shapes. Elias ran his finger over them slowly, breath-catching as he reached the center. "These weren't made for beauty," he murmured. "They're meant to activate memory, maybe even shape it." Vale didn't just want to show people their fears. He wanted to install them. Margaret felt her skin crawl. Why? Elias didn't answer. Instead, he began tearing through his notes, muttering names and numbers, holding pages up to the frame, comparing sketches. Then he froze. "Look," he said, "this spiral here, I've seen it before." He pulled out a diagram, one of the old pages from Vale's ledger. The same symbol was drawn in the margin beside a list of test subjects, circled twice in red. Subject number 12, female, 16 years old, no prior trauma reported. Outcome, static, followed by symbolic overlay. No definitive death image, noted cognitive resistance. Elias stared at Margaret. Subject 12, that was you. "That ledger's over 30 years old," she said, voice shaking. I wasn't even born. You weren't, he said, but someone like you was. And Vale may have tested the entire bloodline. What if this mirror was built not just to record death, but to study those who resist it? The thought sat heavy in her chest. So what am I? You're the one thing it can't fully read, Elias whispered, but it's trying to. That night, Margaret returned to the mirror alone. She brought nothing, no notebook, no lamp, no fear she could name, only questions. She stared into the glass, static. Then, slowly, something shifted. The fog parted, just barely, revealing a tunnel of repeating spirals, black ink, red edges, narrowing into a single point. And in that point, not a death, not a face, but a symbol, the same one from the frame. It pulsed once, like breath. Then her own outline emerged again, flickering, but this time she was holding something. A key, not metal, not for doors, a key of bone. When she blinked, it was gone. Elias found her still standing there an hour later. She told him what she saw. He said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered, "If you're the key, Margaret, then the mirror wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to open you." The crack in the glass deepened that night, curling outward like a root breaking through soil, and in her notebook, under the preacher's name, a new phrase had appeared written in the same crooked hand that haunted the margins. She's starting to remember. Margaret began dreaming in symbols, not places, not faces, just spirals, flickering across the inside of her eyelids like coals pulsing under breath. Each time she woke, her skin was damp and her fingertips tingled, as if she'd been tracing the carvings in her sleep. By the third night, she started bleeding from her nose. Elias noticed first, handing her a handkerchief without a word. But the look on his face was not concern, it was recognition. He had seen this before, somewhere in the pages, somewhere in the ledgers. "The key isn't just symbolic," he said quietly. "Whatever this mirror is doing to you, it started the unlocking." That same day, Margaret found a sealed envelope wedged behind the back panel of the mirror. It hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had, but the mirror hadn't wanted it found. Inside was a single page, brittle with age, scrawled in Vale's unmistakable hand. It was addressed not to a colleague, but to the mirror itself. "You are not the window, you are the weight. I have shaped you with purpose, but purpose without containment becomes hunger. You must be fed only what serves the threshold. The static means she is not ready." The page ended with a sketch, Margaret's sketch, her outline, her hair, her hands, drawn perfectly, long before she was born. Elias read it 3 times before speaking. "He built it to evolve," he said, "to test generation after generation until it found the one mind that didn't break, just bent." "And then what?" Margaret asked. "Then it opens," he said. "Not for us, for whatever's waiting on the other side." That night, the fog in the mirror changed. It no longer drifted. It spun slow and deliberate, like a storm circling in water. The outline of Margaret's figure no longer flickered. It stood fully formed, now slightly ahead of her, hands pressed to the inside of the glass. It moved when she didn't. It blinked when she stared. She raised a hand. It raised the other. A mirror still, but inverted. A door. Elias lit every candle in the house and began writing furiously. "We have to interrupt it," he said, "before the pattern completes, before it finishes writing you." But when he tried to touch the mirror again, he screamed, pulled back with blistered fingertips, skin burned as if from frost. The glass had frozen over in a perfect circle, the size of Margaret's face. "It's not showing anything anymore," Elias whispered. "It's remembering, holding on." And in her notebook, the final line of Vale's letter had copied itself word for word, in fresh ink she hadn't touched. "When the key becomes aware, the door forgets to stay shut." Margaret closed the book with shaking hands. The mirror didn't want death, not anymore. It wanted through. The townspeople turned on the Delanceys the way sickness moves through a body, slow at first, then sudden, merciless. It began with whispers in the market, then cold shoulders at the chapel. By week's end, A stone shattered their front window, and someone carved a single word into the side of their barn. Witch. Margaret watched from the parlor as her father patched the boards in silence, shoulders drawn tight. Her mother no longer left her sewing room. Elias took to carrying a blade tucked into his coat, not out of malice, but out of certainty that something was coming. They didn't blame the mirror. They blamed Margaret. Word had spread of her standing alone in the hall, of the notebook filled with symbols, of her name written in Vale's hand decades before her birth. She brought it awake. Someone hissed outside their gate. She's the reason it keeps moving. Margaret hadn't left the house in 3 days. Her reflection no longer matched her. In the mirror, her eyes were too wide, too still. Her mouth never moved unless she forced it to. But worst of all, her mirrored self had stopped mimicking her. It now looked past her, toward the world beyond the glass, toward something else. The crack had grown into a fracture, curling upward like the limb of some skeletal tree. Elias tried to study it, but could no longer stand within 10 feet of the frame without bleeding from the ears. "It's rejecting me," he said, stuffing cloth in his nostrils. "I'm no longer part of its design." Margaret didn't know what that made her. Not an outsider, not a victim, something in between. That night, a knock came at the door. It was a girl no older than 7 eyes wide with terror. Her mother had looked into the mirror that morning. She now sat motionless at home, mouth open, eyes black with ink, pupils swallowed whole. "She keeps whispering a name," the girl said. "Yours." Margaret didn't wait for permission. She took her coat and followed the girl through the snow. Inside the cottage, the woman sat upright in a chair, not blinking, arms stiff at her sides. The name Margaret spilled from her lips in a steady chant, voice hoarse, almost mechanical. Her fingernails were cracked and bleeding, claw marks etched into the floor beneath her feet. On the wall above her, drawn in charcoal, smeared but deliberate, was the mirror's spiral, the same symbol carved into the glass, the same one from Margaret's dreams. Elias arrived moments later, breath ragged, clutching his satchel. He stared at the wall, then at Margaret. "It's not just in the glass anymore," he said. "It's spreading. The pattern's taken root in memory, in people." Margaret turned back to the woman, who had finally stopped chanting. Her lips were now sealed, but her eyes locked on Margaret's face with one final look of understanding, or warning. Then she spoke one last time. Not a name, just a sentence. "It wants what's behind you." It was Elias who found the trapdoor, though Margaret would always believe the mirror wanted it found. He'd been pacing the parlor in circles, muttering again about pattern repetition, about architectural inconsistencies. Then he stopped mid-step and crouched. There, beneath the rug, beneath the floorboards, a seam, perfectly square, sealed with rusted nails, and stained at the edges with something too dark to be oil. Together, they pried it open. A ladder descended into blackness that did not behave like ordinary dark. It swallowed the lantern light before it reached the bottom. Margaret went first. The air below smelled of salt and ash and something older. The walls were stone, damp with condensation, pulsing faintly as if they breathed. When Elias reached her side, he didn't speak. Neither of them did, not at first. They moved through a narrow corridor that sloped downward. On either side, rusted hooks, broken mirrors in varying sizes, and boxes filled with yellowed paper scraps. Notes, calculations, some in Vale's hand, some in others, but all of them featured the same thing, the spiral. It was everywhere, scratched into walls, stitched into fabric, etched into bone. In the chamber at the end of the passage, they found the source, a mirror larger than the one upstairs. Not a replica, an origin. Its frame was carved not from wood, but from something blacker, almost like stone, melted and cooled again. Its surface was not reflective. It was hollow, depthless, a window without glass, and behind it they saw nothing, but they felt it. Pressure in the chest, ringing in the ears, the sensation of being remembered by something vast. Ilias dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Margaret steadied him, heart pounding, gaze fixed on the black mirror. The one upstairs wasn't the original. It was the decoy, the lens, This was the mouth. A metal plaque lay on the ground nearby, half buried in dust. She brushed it clean. Containment Chamber 3. Threshold Study. Cognitive Mirror Prototype. Access restricted to Alric Vale and authorized continuation subjects. Margaret's name was scrawled beside it in newer ink. Shaking, she turned to Elias, whose nose was bleeding again. "We need to destroy it," she whispered. "This, all of this." But he shook his head slowly, eyes wide with realization. "You can't destroy something that's already been let in." The black mirror shimmered, just slightly, as if acknowledging them, as if listening. And Margaret felt it then, what the others had not. Not death, not fear, recognition. The spiral wasn't trying to trap her, it had been calling her home. She grabbed Elias's hand and pulled him to his feet. "We seal the stairs, we burn what we can, we bury the rest." "And the mirror?" he asked. She didn't answer, because she already knew the truth. The mirror didn't need to be looked at anymore. It had already seen them, and once something sees you clearly enough, it never forgets. They sealed the trapdoor by morning. Elias poured lamp oil around the frame, salted the edges, and hammered it shut with nails soaked in vinegar and ash. It was more ritual than science, but neither of them questioned it. Fear had outpaced reason. Still, Margaret knew it wasn't enough. The mirror upstairs hadn't moved in 2 nights, but the house had grown colder, heavier. The walls groaned like old ribs, and every mirror in the house, bathroom, bedroom, even the polished teapot, reflected slightly off, like light was bending through someone else's memory. Elias hadn't slept. He worked by candlelight, transcribing Vale's remaining notes, trying to find the thread that tied it all together. He never intended to stop, he said. The chamber downstairs, it wasn't an end, it was a beginning. He wanted to place these mirrors across the country, to study fear across bloodlines, generational trauma triggered by reflection. Margaret sat in the hallway, eyes on the original mirror. The fracture across its surface had stopped growing, but something pulsed faintly beneath it now, like a heartbeat behind glass. She remembered the plaque downstairs, access restricted to Vale and authorized continuation subjects. Continuation. That was the word that lingered. Not possession, not curse, continuation. As if she had been born into something still unfolding. Her dreams had sharpened. No more spirals, no more fog. Now she stood in a corridor made of mirrors, each one a memory. She saw her mother as a child, holding a doll with no face. Her father digging something up in the orchard and reburying it before sunrise. Herself, older, too old, staring into a mirror that reflected nothing but fire. Margaret woke with blood on her pillow. The next morning, Elias set up a circle of salt and copper wire around the mirror. "We have to finish the test," he said. "We need to know if it's bonded to you." "It's already inside me," she said quietly. "The tests are done." "Then what does it want now?" he asked. "It wants someone to finish the work," she said. "It doesn't want to kill me, Elias. It wants me to remember what Vale started, and to carry it forward." The mirror pulsed once, like a breath drawn. Then the surface flickered. For the first time, it showed her not her outline, not her death, but a desk, a map, a stack of identical mirrors, each labeled with a different town name. One of them, Halcroft, her own town, her own street. Then the image disappeared. Margaret stepped back. "It's not haunting me. It's recruiting me." Elias stared at her, pale. "Then, the only way to stop it," she nodded, "is to deny the reflection, to forget." But as she turned away, the mirror showed her one final thing, her own face, not fearful, not broken, but calm. And behind her, Elias, holding a knife. When she looked back, he was gone. Only the notebook remained, pages open. On the last page, final test pending. Subject must choose. The knife wasn't real, not in her hand, not on the floor, not in Elias's satchel, but Margaret could still feel it, the weight of it, the cold press of the blade against the base of her skull. That was the mirror's gift, now not vision, but sensation. a death not foretold but offered, like a choice folded into her palm. When Elias returned, he looked unchanged. No blood, no weapon. Just a tired man with ink-stained fingers and a question in his eyes he couldn't form into words. She said nothing, neither did he. But the silence between them was thicker than anything the mirror had ever shown. That night, the house changed. Not violently, not all at once, just shifted. Rooms longer than they had been, lamps taking too long to light. The floorboards creaked in places no one stepped. And the mirror began to glow. Not brightly, just enough. A dim pulse under the surface, soft and steady, like breath, or waiting. Margaret stood in the doorway and stared at her reflection. It no longer copied her. It no longer flickered. It had developed an independence she could no longer deny. Her mirrored self blinked slower, moved differently, tilted its head when she did not, and worse, it smiled. "What happens if I step through?" she whispered. Elias stood behind her, arms crossed. "Maybe you don't step through," he said. "Maybe it steps out." She turned toward him. "What if it already has?" He didn't answer, just walked to the far corner of the room and opened his journal. But the mirror rippled again, and this time the surface bent forward just slightly, like something testing its weight against the edge. "It's not trying to be seen anymore," Elias said. "It's trying to become." Margaret took the notebook from him and flipped to the last page. Her own handwriting greeted her, but she hadn't written it. Not yet. "I let it in. I thought I could control it. I became the key. I became the door." She slammed the book shut. The mirror flashed. For a heartbeat, she saw Vale's face. Not as a man, but as a silhouette long-limbed, eyes burning like polished coal, mouth sewn shut with thread that glowed red as embers. And then he was gone. Only her reflection remained. This time, it reached out. The glass didn't stop it. Its hand moved through like water. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't step back. She let the cold fingers touch her chest, press gently against her heart. Her body remained still, but her reflection mouthed something. One word. "Remember." The hand withdrew. The glass went dark. And for the first time since the day Tobias died, Margaret felt nothing. No fear, no pressure, only stillness. As if the mirror had finally gotten what it came for. And she no longer knew which side of the glass she stood on. The mirror did not speak. It never had. But now the silence it held was louder than any voice Margaret had ever known. It filled the house, pressed against the windows, thickened the walls like fog seeping into the wood. Elias tried to talk to her that morning, tried to ask what she'd seen, what it had said, but Margaret couldn't answer, not because she didn't remember, because she did. Every vision, every flicker of someone else's death, every spiral, every unfinished sentence in Vale's notes, every time she had seen herself reflected in something that wasn't quite her. It wasn't memory anymore. It was presence. The mirror had nested, not in the house, not in the glass, but in her. Elias watched her move through rooms like a stranger. He marked her footsteps, took notes on how she no longer blinked when passing windows, how her voice, when she did speak, came slower, more certain, as if time inside her had been rearranged. "It's using you to finish something," he said quietly. "Some kind of continuity, a loop. Maybe you're not the last subject. Maybe you're the first one that worked." Margaret said nothing. She sat in front of the mirror for hours now, but no longer watched it. She listened, and the mirror pulsed when she did, faint but steady, like a heart sinking itself to hers. That afternoon, the mirror moved again, only it didn't change location. It changed room. One moment, it was in the hallway. The next, it was upstairs, inside Margaret's childhood bedroom, where no one had entered since Tobias died. Elias found it there at dusk, Margaret already seated before it, legs crossed like a child, waiting for a bedtime story. "You're not her anymore," he said. "You're not the girl who buried her brother." She turned, eyes darker than he remembered. "No," she said, "I'm the one who dug him up." Elias backed away. He tried to leave, but the hallway had stretched again, longer than it should be, doorways too far, the air thick like syrup. He felt the spiral in his mind now, uncoiling behind his eyes. "You're going to finish Vale's work," he whispered. "Aren't you?" Margaret stood. "I already did." She stepped toward him, notebook in hand, pages fluttering with breathless movement. One landed at his feet. His name was on it. Date of birth. And below it, observed reaction to mirror trauma. Useful. Elias opened his mouth to protest, to plead, to run. But the mirror flickered. His reflection was already gone, replaced by static. Cold, gray, waiting. He never made it back down the stairs. Margaret remained in the room long after. The glass no longer showed anything at all. Only her, alone, centered, unmoving. The mirror didn't need to kill anymore. It only needed to replicate, and it had found someone who remembered how. Margaret locked the house from the inside. Every door, every window. Not to keep something out, but to keep the mirror in, or maybe to keep it from following her again. She wrapped Elias's body in linen and laid him beneath the floorboards in the study, beneath the very spot where the trapdoor had once opened. She did it gently, lovingly, as if he were a page being turned. No blood, no violence. He had simply stopped being useful. That was the word the mirror had offered her. Not killer, not heir. Useful. She walked through the house barefoot now. The mirror no longer pulsed. It shimmered faintly, always watching, but no longer demanding. It had no need to test her anymore. It had passed through. She was its memory now. And memories didn't die, they replicated. Outside, the snow had started falling again, but the town had grown quiet, a stillness that wasn't peace, but pause, as if the whole place was waiting to see what she would do next. Margaret knew what they feared, that she would carry the mirror to them, that she would open doors in their minds, the way Vale once had quietly, methodically, without leaving a mark. But she didn't need to carry anything. The spiral was already blooming across the town, in puddles, in window panes, in the backs of spoons. Reflections were bending. People were dreaming in patterns. The mirror no longer needed a frame. It had found enough minds willing to believe. Margaret watched them from her window, neighbors stumbling through their routines with tremors in their hands, children pointing at invisible things, dogs refusing to pass the Delancy gate. One man stopped on the path and looked up at the house. He didn't speak, but he nodded, slowly, as if he already knew her name. She nodded back. That night, Margaret sat at the base of the mirror and opened her notebook. She no longer wrote in it, it wrote through her. Symbols poured from her hands in curves and coils, spirals within spirals. No words. Just memory, drawn from someplace deeper than blood. She was no longer writing a record. She was preparing a guide, a blueprint, for the next one. When the last candle died, she saw movement in the mirror, her reflection, only older, worn, yet peaceful. A version of her that had lived longer than she ever expected. This time, it didn't mimic her. It winked. She smiled. It was time. Margaret stood and reached forward. Her fingers passed through, not cold, not sharp, just weightless, like dipping her hand into fog. Then she stepped through, not gone, not vanished, continued. Behind her, the house remained still, the mirror now dark. A glass heart at rest, until the next knock, until the next question, until the next girl asked what the spiral meant. They didn't find the house for weeks. By then the snow had melted just enough to reveal the outline of something that shouldn't have been there, a second chimney, a wall that didn't match the others, a boarded window facing east that no one remembered seeing before. When the townspeople finally entered, the inside was untouched. No sign of struggle. No blood, no broken glass. Just dust, folded linens, and a silence so complete it made the floorboards ache beneath their boots. Margaret was gone. So was Elias. But the mirror remained. It stood in the upstairs bedroom, where the sunlight could never quite reach. Its surface was clean, crackless, whole. The fracture that had once split it like bone had vanished without a trace. It reflected everything perfectly now, too perfectly. When the mayor's wife peered into it, she smiled nervously and said she looked younger. When the sheriff followed, he said he didn't see himself at all, just the room behind him, stretched slightly too long, like someone had pulled the edges of the world. By the third day, 12 people had looked. By the fifth, 24. They came in secret at first, then openly, then with others. Some claimed they saw fire, some saw nothing. A few said they saw themselves asleep, smiling. No one could explain what it meant. No one wanted to. They just kept returning. Margaret's notebook was found in the parlor drawer, its last page torn out. The rest was full of drawings, spirals, doorways, mirrored rooms with no exits, and names, dozens of them. Some crossed out, some circled, all of them followed by two words. Pattern confirmed. The townspeople burned the ledger. They buried Elias's satchel, but no one touched the mirror, not even the children, especially not the children. One girl, no more than 10, stared into it for nearly an hour. When asked what she saw, she only said, "Something that remembers me." The house was never locked again. People came and went, whispering their reflections back into place. They brought offerings, now coins, ribbons, pieces of glass, and the mirror stayed still. It had no reason to move anymore. It had moved far enough. At night, some swore they heard footsteps upstairs. Not heavy, just soft, barefoot steps on the old wood, pacing gently from wall to wall, the sound of someone remembering how to be alive, or practicing. The preacher's son, grown now, returned once to the hallway. He didn't look in. He just stood there a long time and then whispered into the air, "Do you know how many people you've touched?" From the glass came a single flicker, a shimmer like breath against still water, then silence. The mirror did not answer, but it did not have to. It had never needed words, only eyes. They say the mirror is quiet now. It hasn't moved in years. The Delancy house still stands, tilted, tired, its shutters sagging, its porch cracked down the middle like a mouth that once told too many secrets. No one lives there, not really. People visit, they whisper, they stare at the dust on the windows and the light that never touches the upstairs hallway. But no one sweeps the floor, no one opens the drawers. The mirror remains, whole, waiting. It reflects what you bring to it. That has always been the rule. Not death, not fate, just the weight of your own mind pressed back at you through perfect glass. There are stories now, of course, children born with spiral-shaped birthmarks behind their ears. A boy in the next county who stopped speaking after glancing at a puddle. A seamstress who dreams in languages no one taught her. The town doesn't call it haunted. That would imply fear. And fear, they've learned, is an invitation. Instead, they call it watched. The watched house, the watched mirror, the watched town. Every few years, someone new writes a letter about it. Someone else asks to study the house, to catalog the names in Margaret's notebook. But the notebook is gone. And Margaret? Some say she still walks the rooms at night, barefoot and humming. Others say she stepped through a door none of us can see and became a part of the mirror's design, a permanent pattern, a living spiral. One girl left a drawing once, folded and pinned to the fence post, a sketch of the mirror, perfectly rendered, with one detail no one could explain. At the base of the frame, where the old crack once curved like a broken tree limb, she'd drawn a child's handprint, small, smudged, pressed from the inside. No one knows who the girl was. She never came back. But sometimes, when the wind pulls just right, the mirror's surface ripples, not like water, but like breath being held, like something inside is listening for a name it remembers, waiting for someone to speak it. And when they do, when someone dares to say Margaret or Elias or even Vale, the glass does not shatter. It tightens, not visibly, not violently, just enough, just a subtle shift, as if the world had blinked, as if, for one heartbeat, the house had turned its gaze directly onto you. You can walk away. You should, but you won't, because deep down, you've already asked the question. And the mirror? The mirror already knows your answer. It always has. Comment the oldest town in your country, and if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, Like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.